the most and least important characters on Fire Country is Riley Leone. I say most because her ghost is the shadow that haunts the plot. It's the backstory that holds five of our seven main characters together and draws a line between the Perez's and the rest of the cast. I say least because, well, we don't really know that much about her, and she has two scenes in the entire show. Riley's character is really one which must be put together piecemeal. We know she played baseball or maybe softball as a kid. We don't know how good she was per se, but in season 3, Walters says that she was a good shortstop and he taught her how to play. We know that Riley won at least one game because Vince says in their Little League days his kids beat the kids of West Brooks, a man the crew fails to save in the season 1 episode Happy to Help. Riley's place in the childhood memories of Eve, Jake, and Bodie is sporadic. Sometimes she's mentioned rock climbing, like in the season 1 episode Like Old Times. Other times she's missing, like Bodie, Eve, and Jake's memory of sharing a single beer at someone's sweet 16 in the season 2 episode No Future, No Consequences.
My personal favorite Riley memory is from the season 3 episode Firing Squad, when Vince recalls her, Bodie, Jake, and Eve sneaking beers out of the fridge in spring break of 2009, when Bodie would have been 16 and Riley would have been like 12 to 14. Don't ask me why, but I think that the idea of very straight-laced by the book Vince Leone just fondly remembering his daughter drinking as a young teenager is peak comedy. I think the most important memory about Riley, though, is actually the memory that she tells us.
During Bodhi's flashbacks to her last night alive in the season 1 episode The Fresh Prince of Edgewater, Riley recalls being about 9 years old when she marched across the street and asked new to town Eve, "Wanna be best friends?" I love that this random family of a different race moves in across the street. Riley sees they have a girl about her age, and boom, brand new best friend. This is why I prefer fanfictions where Riley is just a little mini Sharon. It fits much better than the generic too good for this sinful world Riley.
So, if someone asked me to describe Riley's personality, I would say she's probably feisty, probably sweet, and at least a little bit rebellious, but better at knowing where the boundaries are than her older brother. Really, though, Riley's importance in the narrative is what earns her a spot in this essay series. Riley herself is a perfect example of what we in fandom media call a fridge character. Actually, I asked one of my online best friends, Milkfur, if he would disown me if I actively participated in Riley's fridging, and he said that apparently I am too cool to be disowned, so just know that I was very disappointed that he didn't say yes for the bit. Very out of character for him because he hates fridging. In fandom spaces, fridging means taking a character and killing them solely for the character development of another character. But fridging has a very specific gendered context. It's almost always a female character, and she's almost always being killed off to further the character development of a male character. Usually it's a brother, father, son, or husband, but really it could be any man. I wanted to go over some of our Riley moments because, well, just because she was created as a fridge character doesn't mean we should just ignore all of her moments where she actually gets to be a fun, posthumous character with personality and backstory. There are many ways in which Riley serves as a plot device or works for the character development of another character, and her relationship with Jake is something that I am going to go over in his essay. The thing that stands out to me most about Riley is the impact that her death had on the members of her immediate family. And this is going to be controversial, but I would include Luke as a member of her immediate family. And that's largely just due to the framing on the show. He almost never talks about Riley, but he's the only character who knew Riley and never talks about her. So to me, that feels meaningful. I just do not know the meaning at this exact moment. And I know you're going to say, well, he wasn't at her birthday party. How important could he be? And to that, I need to remind you that the station leadership at that time was Sharon, Vince, and Luke. So if Sharon and Vince are going to be off, that means that, well, someone has to be working and running the station.
We see the immediate aftermath of Riley's death through Vince's flashbacks in the season 1 episode Bad Guy. Across the three flashbacks, we see Vince, Bodhi, Sharon, and Luke trying to cope with the aftermath of Riley's death. There are extras in these scenes, but none of them talk. Actually, Bad Guy is both my favorite episode of Fire Country and one of the most important episodes of Fire Country, living right beside episodes like End of My Rope and Alert the Sheriff. I'm planning to do a more in depth breakdown of the entire episode of Bad Guy across my two Vince essays, so this essay will just be focusing on the flashbacks. Vince's flashbacks in Bad Guy aren't random snapshots of that night. Instead, each one is directly triggered by external stimuli. In the context of this episode, it makes sense. The crew were trying to save a brother and sister from a precarious car crash where they could go over the edge of a bridge at any minute. At the beginning of the accident, Eve checks on Bodhi to make sure he's okay with even working the accident, and while Bodhi says he's fine, Bodhi is worried that Vince might not be okay. But the crew decides not to do anything. Vince is the boss after all. While this may have been a reasonable call in the beginning, as the episode goes on, it becomes more and more clear that Vince shouldn't have been on this rescue. His stress level increases with every scene or precarious moment. And I'm not attacking Vince for getting stressed in a legitimately stressful rescue. Manny also gets more and more frustrated as time goes on, but Vince, he's not just short tempered, he's falling apart. He goes from his normal self to almost crying at the thought of one of the kids not being saved. The flashbacks to the night Riley died are just a part of it. Bodhi is the only one who recognizes that Vince is not okay, including him recognizing the immediate aftermath of one of these flashbacks, but Vince responds to Bodhi's concern with defensiveness. When Bodhi brings this concern up to Eve and Gabriella, they defer to Jake.
Even though these flashbacks are short, only about a minute each, I think they're some of the most important backstory we get on the entire show. Across less than 4 minutes, we can truly understand the dynamics of the Leone household, and like I said, I include Luke in that. Ordinarily, when I break something down, whether I'm doing it for my mom when we're having an episode rewatch, or if I'm trying to work through something, I do it line by line, beat by beat. But that doesn't really work here. Not just because almost every frame is important, but because really it's about how all four characters act in all three flashbacks, and they have patterns, they have things that they do, and we see them in all three flashbacks. But because there are just so many moments in just those couple of minutes, I'm gonna have to do something different. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go through the facts of the flashbacks first, just a very surface level read. And then I'm going to go through each character's behavior. So we're gonna start with Vince, move on to Luke, Sharon, and end with Bodhi.
In flashback 1, which I call the accident flashback, we see Vince running into the scene of Riley's accident, but he doesn't make it to the accident. Luke stops him. On that night, Luke is captain. He's in charge of running the response, and when a quick "Hey, Chief, no" doesn't work, Luke has to respond by holding Vince back. After a few seconds, Vince stops trying to get to the scene, and instead he collapses on the ground crying. Luke falls back, hands on his knees, saying, "I'm sorry." Meanwhile, Bodhi is in the background watching all of this with his arm bandaged. Sharon's location is unknown. In flashback 2, which I call the attack flashback, that takes place at the Leone house and opens with Vince and Sharon sitting on the floor crying and holding on to each other. Then Bodhi walks in with Luke right behind him, still in his Cal Fire blues. Vince questions Bodhi about the accident and Bodhi's past drug use. When Bodhi tries to explain that Riley tried to get out of the car, Vince attacks. Luke has to pull Vince off of Bodhi and restrain him while Bodhi and Sharon flee upstairs. In the final flashback, which I call the I hate him flashback, Vince tells Luke that he hates Bodhi, himself, and Luke, in that order. Unfortunately, Bodhi hears this and starts crying. Even more unfortunate, Vince sees, and it's kind of implied that this is a motivating factor behind why Bodhi got kicked out.
So now that we have all of the scenes fresh in our minds, let's go back through each character and kind of break down the patterns that we can see them exhibit across these scenes. Starting with Vince, his behavior follows a very clear pattern across these three flashbacks. There are three things that happen in each scene. It starts with Vince in one state, maybe apprehensive, maybe grieving. Then he quickly switches into a state of fighting and becomes incredibly dangerous to either himself or the people around him. From there, Luke ends up restraining Vince until the anger subsides and Vince collapses emotionally. With these patterns in mind, let me walk through those 3 scenes for you.
You see it first in the accident scene. Vince is apprehensive for a few seconds until he realizes what's going on. Then he attempts to charge right into the scene of Riley's accident. Luke holds Vince back while Vince screams at him. Eventually, Vince stops fighting, falls on the ground, and starts crying. Moving on to the attack scene, Vince starts on the floor crying with Sharon that Riley's death is his fault. When Bodhi gets home, we see Vince harden into a state of anger, and when Bodhi tries to explain that Riley attempted to get out of the car, Vince escalates into rage. Luke manages to get a hold of Vince, and while Vince does initially hit Luke's back, he softens and allows his brother to hug him.
Author, wait! I hear you screaming now. Luke doesn't have to hold Vince back in that last scene. All Vince does is sit on the couch and say he hates Bodhi. And to that I say, Vince is lashing out in that scene, just like in the fight scene. But this time he's lashing out emotionally.
He isn't making an argument about who's at fault in Riley's death. He blames Bodhi, himself, and Luke, all within a few seconds, and when Luke fights back, Vince doubles down. We aren't sure how this scene ends, but we do know that Bodhi was standing right outside the living room when he hears at least some portion of what Vince said in his anger and starts crying. Vince sees Bodhi and he hardens again. While we don't see Bodhi get kicked out or know the exact words that were used, the anger on Vince's face and our own knowledge of what happened that night is enough to connect the dots. It's actually Luke's behavior in these flashbacks that interests me the most. Luke is a character who always has a scheme cooking. But when you look at these flashbacks, everything just seems very improvised. His pattern over and over again is that he tries something, fails to calm his brother, and then Luke has to resort to restraining Vince. Luke lets go as soon as he senses the danger has passed.
But it's not just that Luke is improvising. It's that he's failing to anticipate what Vince might do. Vince is clearly too upset to be reasoned with in the accident scene, but that's Luke's first tactic before resorting to restraining Vince when Vince tries to run past him. Likewise, if Luke had actually anticipated that Vince would attack Bodhi, I don't think Luke would have taken him home. One of my coworkers, when she watched the episode, was confused about why Luke didn't anticipate Vince's physical violence. But the more I think about it, the less confused I am. I feel very confident to say that with the exception of this one scene, Vince wasn't physically abusive towards Bodhi. We would know if he was. Especially when you consider how often Bodhi is calling out Vince's abusive behavior, especially in the early episodes. Vince's lashing out isn't a sign that he's physically abusive or that he always had it in him. Non-violent people can become violent, lashing out when they're going through an extremely traumatic event, like the death of their child in a horrific car accident.
Actually, I want to draw your attention to the accident. Now, I'm not sure how many of you were traumatized through Dare Summer Camp, but let me assure you, Bodhi's accident looks to me exactly like the drunk driving accidents we saw in Dare. It's important to point out that there is no way Bodhi was drinking that night. The cops were there, and they would have tested Bodhi as soon as possible, but in his grieving and traumatized state, I can see how Vince may have jumped to that conclusion and how Luke wouldn't have even considered the possibility. Instead, Luke doesn't seem to move into action in the attack scene until after Vince has slammed Bodhi into the wall. Then he grabs his brother around the throat to get him away from Bodhi, and Luke tells Vince that it wasn't Bodhi's fault. There is one time Luke seems to anticipate his brother's behavior. That's in the I hate him scene. Luke seems like he's struggling when Vince attacks him verbally, and Luke fights back. He says that he treated the kids the same in response to being accused of being a bad influence on Bodhi. Interestingly enough, though, Luke doesn't defend Bodhi.
Luke doesn't know this, but Bodhi is standing literally right there, so he hears his dad attack him, and then Uncle Luke just lets that attack stand. Now, you may be wondering what Sharon is doing while Luke and Vince are going back and forth and doing all of this, and the answer is not much.
She's only in the attack scene. We first see her on the floor with Vince crying as he's blaming himself, and she puts her hands on his face. When Bodhi comes in, she gets up, but she follows Vince's lead. As Vince starts the interrogation, Sharon weakly says stop it and grabs his arm. Then, after Vince attacks, Sharon tries to force the two apart, but it's Luke who's actually successful. Sharon covers Bodhi's body with hers, and when Luke forces Vince back, the last we see of her is she and Bodhi disappearing upstairs together. When Bodhi comes back downstairs in the next flashback, she is nowhere to be seen.
Now we get around to Bodhi, and he's interesting in these scenes too. He's present in every scene, but he's off to the side except when Vince attacks him. In the accident scene, he is completely unacknowledged by Vince or Luke. In the fight scene, neither Luke nor Sharon do anything to help Bodhi as he's accused of using drugs until he's been physically attacked. It's not entirely clear why he comes downstairs during the I hate him scene, much less how much of that he actually heard, but he is there and Sharon is nowhere to be seen. Not only is Bodhi physically present in each scene, we can see his injuries from the crash. He has a broken arm, and cuts on his face are very prominent in every scene. To me, it's a visual reminder that Bodhi is an injured, traumatized young adult. And yet, look at the three adults in his life. Vince can't keep himself together as his emotions swing wildly. Luke, who always has a plan for everything, is just doing what he can to keep Vince from hurting himself or anyone else. And Sharon, the woman we all know and love for her feistiness, is just kind of there. So for me, this is the key to Riley and how she fits into all of it. You've got the three adults constantly interacting with each other, being there for each other, but when it comes to interacting with, the literal traumatized child standing right there in tears, not so much. Bodhi just watched his sister die. He heard her last word, which was his name, and he just has to keep it to himself because the adults who are supposed to be taking care of him are falling apart.
One big question I've always had is why didn't Bodhi tell Luke or Sharon that Vince wanted to make him leave? But I think the answer is right there in front of us, because they didn't do much to protect him earlier in the night. While these scenes are when all of our characters are in a heightened state, I think that together they give us a picture of what this family dynamic looked like. Earlier in the night, they had all been happy or at work, and by the end of the night, they're just absolutely falling apart. With Vince and Sharon barely able to take care of themselves and certainly unable to take care of Bodhi. And who does Luke choose to spend his energy on? Vince.
Now, I know some of you guys are thinking, wow, author, these people just lost their beloved daughter, cut them some slack. And to that I say, Sharon and Vince are parents. I understand parents are people too, but when it comes to taking care of their child, you really can't just phone it in. You can't just say, sorry, child, I've decided I'm too upset to take care of you. And really, that goes for Luke too. When you watch the show, you can see over and over again how he tries to show Vince up, always wanting to be in the role of Bodhi's parent. But, the second some actual parenting needs done, like protecting an already traumatized Bodhi from an emotionally unstable Vince, Luke's desire just goes out the window. Now, I'm sure you're wondering how this fits into the larger season 1 narrative.
On the night Riley died, what do we see? The three adults taking care of each other, while Bodhi is left alone despite him being in the most need. We also see that very thing play out in the last 5 minutes of the season 1 finale. Sharon, Vince, and Luke sit together, front row in their Cal Fire dress uniforms. Bodhi, on the other hand, sits at a table with his public defender beside him. And I will remind you that in the episode A Cry for Help, Sharon said she wanted to get Jake a lawyer. So they had the money. Bodhi was just settled with the public defender anyway. Just like how the night Riley died ends with Bodhi going off to live alone, Bodhi is taken to a cell away from everybody where he sits alone and cries while touching the tattoo for his little sister.
And we're going to talk about why in a couple of weeks. Thank you guys for watching this video. Please stick around and I'll have a new video out very soon.